I thought staying late after class was just about finishing an assignment, but one quiet conversation with my teacher unraveled something I've been carrying for years. What he said was simple, even gentle, yet it stopped me cold and forced me to see myself in a way I never had before. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. The hallway was almost empty by the time I realized how late it had gotten. The usual after-class noise had faded away, replaced by the soft hum of the cleaning machine somewhere down the corridor and the distant slam of a locker being shut for the last time that day. Outside the tall windows, the sky had that muted, dusty blue color that comes right before evening settles in. I remember glancing at my phone, surprised by the time, and then back down at the papers spread across my desk like they were trying to escape. I'd stayed late because I told myself I needed to. The truth was more complicated than that. I was 21, technically an adult, but still feeling like I was constantly one wrong step away from being exposed as someone who didn't really know what she was doing. That class had been especially hard for me, not because the material was impossible, but because it asked me to think, to reflect, to speak honestly. And honesty, I was learning, could be exhausting. My teacher was still there, of course. He always was. He sat at his desk with his jacket draped over the back of his chair, glasses resting low on his nose as he read something on his computer screen. The room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old books, a scent I'd come to associate with both comfort and quiet pressure. I tried to make myself small as I gathered my things, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But then he looked up. "Still working?" he asked, his voice calm, not accusing, just curious. I nodded, feeling my face warm slightly. "Yeah, I lost track of time." He smiled, not the kind of smile that puts you on the spot, but one that makes space. "That happens when you're actually thinking," he said. "That's not a bad thing." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I tucked a notebook into my bag and stood there, unsure whether to leave or say something more. There was a subtle tension in my chest, like I was standing on the edge of a conversation I didn't know how to begin. "Do you have a minute?" I finally asked. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise him. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Of course." I sat back down, my chair making a soft scraping sound against the floor that felt much louder than it should have. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was full, like it was waiting. "I'm struggling," I admitted, staring at the corner of my desk. "Not just with the class. With figuring out if I'm actually any good at this." He didn't interrupt. He just listened. That alone felt unexpected. After a pause, he said, "Most people who care enough to doubt themselves are the ones who end up doing meaningful work." I looked up at him then. His expression was serious, but kind. No judgment, no disappointment. "I see how hard you try," he continued. "You don't always see it yourself, but it's there. In the questions you ask, in the way you revise your work, in the way you stay late." Something about that hit me harder than I expected. My throat tightened, and I had to swallow before I could speak. All semester, I'd been measuring myself by grades, by deadlines, by how confident everyone else seemed. I hadn't considered that effort itself might mean something. "I guess I'm just scared of wasting time," I said quietly. "Of waking up one day and realizing I chose wrong." He nodded slowly, as if he understood that fear intimately. "That fear doesn't go away," he said. "But it can teach you to pay attention, to choose with care. You're not behind. You're learning." The words were simple. There was no dramatic speech, no sudden revelation, and yet, sitting there in that nearly empty classroom, I felt something shift. It was like someone had gently placed a hand on my back and steadied me, just enough for me to stand a little straighter. We talked a bit longer about the assignment, about pacing myself, about allowing room to grow instead of demanding perfection. When I finally stood to leave, the room felt different, or maybe I did. As I stepped into the hallway, the lights dimmed automatically behind me. I paused for a moment, breathing in the quiet. I hadn't stayed late just to finish work after all. I'd stayed long enough to hear something I didn't know I needed. and it would take me a while to understand just how deeply it would change the way I saw myself. The next day, I kept replaying the conversation in my head like a recording I couldn't turn off. Even walking across campus, I could feel the weight of what had been said, gentle but persistent, pressing against the part of me that had always been quietly terrified of not being enough. I had expected to feel embarrassed for staying late, for opening up like that, but instead, there was a strange sense of calm, a quiet reassurance I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. By mid-afternoon, I found myself back in the classroom, not for class but to review some notes. The room smelled faintly of dust and chalk, the windows letting in that soft winter light that always made everything feel a little slower, a little more contemplative. I sat at the same desk as yesterday, and for a moment, I just stared out at the empty chairs and the scattered papers. There was something comforting in the stillness, like the world had paused just long enough for me to breathe. Then he appeared at the door, his presence so familiar now that I almost didn't notice him at first. "Back again?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I needed to look over some notes," I said, though it felt like a flimsy excuse. "Of course. Sit wherever you like." He leaned casually against the doorframe, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that invited conversation if I wanted it. I did. I wanted it more than I realized. As I worked through the equations and diagrams, I could feel his gaze, quiet, observant, not intrusive. Every so often, he would offer a word of guidance, a suggestion, a correction, and each time, I felt the tension inside me ease a little. There was no judgment, just clarity, and the clarity felt like a balm. Finally, I put down my pen and let out a long sigh. "I think I'm starting to see where I've been going wrong," I admitted. He nodded, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "And where have you been going wrong?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure I could even put it into words. I've been trying to prove myself to everyone else. Grades, recognition. I thought if I could just meet their expectations, I feel like I mattered. But I'm tired. And I'm starting to think maybe that's not the right way to measure myself. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable at first, and then softened. "That's a very important realization," he said. "Most people never get there. They spend their lives chasing validation and don't stop to notice what they're really capable of or who they're becoming." His words made something click inside me. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a mixture of relief and cautious hope. I realized, with a little shock, that I had been holding myself back, not because of anything external, but because I didn't trust my own voice. And here, in this quiet, sunlit classroom, someone had given me permission to hear it. I stayed a little longer, talking about small things at first, notes, assignments, classroom projects, but then gradually we drifted into a deeper conversation. He asked questions that didn't feel like tests, just invitations to think aloud. I found myself opening up about doubts I hadn't even admitted to myself, worries about the future, about making the right choices, about feeling like I had to have everything figured out. He listened, and then, in that calm, measured way of his, he said something I wasn't expecting. "You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to keep paying attention, to keep moving forward, and to trust yourself. You've already proven that you can do that. You just didn't see it yet." I wanted to argue, to say it wasn't true, that I wasn't that capable, but the words settled into me anyway. They didn't feel like praise, not really. They felt like acknowledgement, like someone had seen the parts of me I usually hid and was telling me, quietly, that they were enough. When I finally packed up my things, the room seemed warmer than it had before, and the sky outside was fading to that same dusky blue I remembered from yesterday. I walked down the hallway slowly, savoring the quiet. Something in me had shifted, subtly but profoundly. I was beginning to understand that the journey wasn't about proving myself to anyone else. It was about learning to trust the person I already was. As I stepped outside, I paused for a moment, feeling the cool air against my face, the weight of the day pressing gently on my shoulders. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of possibility, fragile but real, that maybe, just maybe, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I didn't know what the next step would be, or what challenges were waiting, but I knew I could face them with a little more courage than before. And that, I realized was something I had never given myself permission to believe. The quiet of that late afternoon had left its mark on me. I walked home slowly, savoring the feeling, knowing that the words spoken in that empty classroom would echo with me long after the walls were gone, long after the papers were packed away, long after the lights went out. I didn't just stay late after class. I discovered a piece of myself I had been too afraid to see, and it was the beginning of a change I wasn't ready to name but was already grateful for. I remember the morning after that day as if it had been carved into my memory with a quiet precision. The light was softer than usual, diffused through a thin layer of mist that lingered over the campus lawns. I walked to class slower than normal, almost savoring the moments, letting the lingering sense of clarity from yesterday settle into me. My mind wasn't racing with doubts, not completely, not yet. Instead, there was this gentle hum of possibility, a sense that maybe I could approach things differently, that maybe I could let myself matter without needing constant proof. Classroom chatter filled the air as usual, the low murmur of students exchanging weekend stories and hurried greetings, but I felt slightly detached, more present in a quiet, observational way. My desk, neatly tucked in the middle of the room, felt like a safe vantage point to watch and listen without being overwhelmed. And there he was, arriving a few minutes early, calm, unassuming, just setting up his notes and adjusting his glasses in that habitual, quiet way. I wanted to tell him that I carried yesterday's conversation with me, that it had touched something deep inside, but words felt unnecessary at the moment. The lesson began, but I noticed I wasn't just going through motions. I was paying attention to subtleties, the way he emphasized certain points, the gentle pauses between ideas, the encouragement he offered when someone hesitated. I realized I was seeing him in a new light, not just as a teacher imparting knowledge, but as someone who seemed genuinely invested in the growth of his students, someone who believed in them even when they didn't yet believe in themselves. After class, I lingered as usual, gathering my books slowly, giving myself a small buffer of time before facing the hallway's business. He noticed, as he often did, and offered that same small, knowing smile. "You're staying again?" he asked, almost casually, though I could feel an underlying invitation in his tone. I have a few questions," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. I had been rehearsing the questions in my mind all morning, yet now that the moment had arrived, they felt flimsy, even trivial. He gestured for me to sit, and as I did, I noticed something I hadn't before, the way the sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, soft stripes across the wooden floor. It created a pattern of light and shadow, delicate but persistent, almost like it was drawing me into a moment that belonged solely to me and him, outside the rush of schedules and obligations. I laid out my notes, but quickly abandoned them, my attention caught by a thought I had been avoiding, the fear of being seen, really seen, for who I was beyond grades, beyond assignments, beyond the image I presented to the world. I've been thinking, I started, hesitating as the words stumbled out. I've been thinking about how I always try to do everything perfectly, to control the outcome, and I never let myself just be. He listened in that quiet, measured way of his, not interrupting, not filling the silence with platitudes. It was almost more than I could bear, the feeling of being fully heard without being judged. "It's normal," he said finally softly. "We all want control. We all fear the vulnerability that comes with allowing ourselves to be imperfect. But here's the thing, perfection is an illusion. What really matters is authenticity, and that's something you already have in abundance, even if you can't see it yet." His words sank deep, weaving into the corners of my mind I hadn't known were aching for attention. I could feel a subtle trembling inside me, not of fear, but of recognition. Recognition that I had been hiding from myself, shielding myself with routines, with accomplishments, with masks that now felt increasingly fragile. I don't know if I can just be," I admitted, almost whispering. "It feels like if I'm not trying, I'm failing." He leaned back slightly, resting his hand lightly on the edge of his desk, and met my gaze steadily. "Failing isn't staying still. Failing isn't the absence of effort. Failing is the refusal to reflect, to grow, to notice. You've been doing all those things. You've just been judging yourself harshly for it." I swallowed hard, and for the first time, I let myself imagine a different way of moving through life. A way that included mistakes, uncertainty, and yet still held meaning. A way that allowed me to measure myself not by the approval of others, but by my willingness to engage honestly, to learn, to face my own fears with openness. The rest of the conversation drifted naturally, a gentle rhythm that moved from small questions about coursework to reflections on choices, ambition, and purpose. He didn't lecture. He didn't push. He simply guided with patience and insight, allowing me the space to stumble, to consider, to arrive at my own conclusions. When the clock finally reminded us that time had passed, I felt reluctant to leave. I had come seeking answers about assignments, but I was walking away with something far more profound, a glimpse into what it meant to trust oneself, to honor one's own growth without fear or shame. Walking through the empty corridors, the echo of my footsteps felt like a soft accompaniment to the echo of his words in my mind. I realized that this connection, this exchange of thought and understanding, wasn't just about guidance or mentorship. It was about mutual respect, about being seen and acknowledged as a person capable of insight, vulnerability, and resilience. By the time I reached the exit, the evening sky had deepened into rich shades of indigo, and the first stars were starting to appear, tiny points of light piercing the dusk. I paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp air, feeling the weight of the day settle like a gentle promise. I didn't know what lay ahead, or how my understanding of myself would evolve, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of quiet certainty. I was on a path, not perfectly defined, not without doubt, but undeniably mine. And that alone felt like a revelation worth staying late for. The days that followed felt different, though nothing had visibly changed. I walked through campus with a quiet awareness that had been absent before, noticing small details I usually ignored. The way the wind lifted leaves into delicate spirals across the courtyard, the laughter of students echoing off brick walls, the faint smell of old books and coffee drifting from the library. It was as though the world had subtly shifted, or perhaps I had, and the change made everything feel a little sharper, a little more vivid. By now, my visits to the classroom after class had become something I looked forward to, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to reflect, to ask questions, and sometimes simply to sit in the quiet company of someone who seemed to understand without needing to explain. He never forced conversation. He never demanded my attention. He simply offered guidance in a way that respected my pace, my space, my individuality. One afternoon, as golden light spilled across the room and dust motes floated lazily in the beams, I stayed longer than usual. I had no assignments left unfinished, no pressing questions. I just sat, letting the silence and calm of the classroom settle over me, and he noticed. "You're quiet today," he said, setting his cup of coffee on the desk with a soft clink. "I'm thinking," I admitted, "about everything. About the semester, about me, I guess." He nodded, as if he understood more than I could articulate. "That's a good habit," he said, "to pause and consider. The answers often reveal themselves in reflection, not in haste." I smiled faintly, feeling a strange comfort in the simplicity of the exchange. "I've realized something," I said slowly. "I've been measuring myself by the wrong things, by grades, by approval, by constant validation, and it's exhausting." "That's an important realization," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Learning to define your own measures of growth is one of the most valuable lessons you can have. It's not easy, but it's transformative." I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from sadness, but from relief. Relief that someone had named the experience I had been fumbling toward for months. Relief that I could see the value in my own efforts without needing constant external affirmation. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that carries meaning without words. Then, tentatively, I asked, "Do you ever wonder if you're making a difference?" He looked at me, his eyes steady, thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "But the difference isn't always obvious in the moment. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes invisible. But when someone begins to see themselves clearly, to trust themselves, that's a difference that lasts. You're beginning to make that difference in your own life, and in a way, that's enough." His words resonated deeply. I realized that I had been searching for external validation when the most profound acknowledgement I could receive had always been from myself. And here, in that quiet room filled with sunlight and shadows. I felt it, the first true sense of self-trust, fragile but unshakable. The conversation drifted into lighter territory then, plans for the weekend, small observations about campus life, even a few shared laughs. It felt natural, unforced, a delicate balance of mentorship and human connection. I noticed, for the first time, that learning didn't have to be stressful or performative. It could be a dialogue, an exchange that nourished the mind and spirit simultaneously. When it was finally time to leave, I gathered my things slowly, reluctant to break the spell of the afternoon. The hallway outside was quieter than usual, the sun dipping lower, painting everything in warm amber tones. I walked with a sense of calm I hadn't known before, my steps unhurried, my thoughts clear. As I reached the gates of the campus, I paused and looked back. The building stood serene against the fading sky, windows reflecting the last hints of daylight. I realized I had arrived at a place I never expected, not just in my education, but in my own personal journey. I had discovered patience, self-compassion, and the courage to embrace uncertainty without fear. It wasn't a sudden revelation, nor was it a dramatic transformation. It was subtle, cumulative, a series of moments, conversations, reflections that had quietly reshaped the way I viewed myself and my life. And as I walked home under the growing twilight, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the teacher who listened, for the words that were said, for the lessons that weren't in textbooks, but in understanding, empathy, and trust. I realized that staying late after class had been about more than completing assignments. It had been about discovering my own voice, my own worth, and my capacity to grow. By the time I reached my apartment, the stars were scattered across the night sky, bright and steady. I stood for a moment by the window, watching them, feeling the quiet hum of possibilities stretch across the universe. I didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I could face it differently now, with patience, with honesty, and with the understanding that the most meaningful growth often happens in the quiet, unseen moments. And in that quiet reflection, I felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning that belonged solely to me, shaped by courage, insight, and the gentle power of a conversation that had changed everything.